So we are now moving into the afternoon panel session 4 on human nature. And it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this panel, another colleague in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, whose bio you can look up in the back of the program. She does very interesting research, not to be missed. So please welcome to the podium Dr. Sarah Croco. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. Our first presenter will be Dr. Jennifer Larson, who is an associate professor in political science at Vanderbilt University. She received her BA in mathematics and political science from Creighton University and her PhD in political science from Harvard University. Her research explores how and why social networks affect political behavior in order to explain outcomes such as protest, civil conflict, and informal governments. Okay, and with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
All right, well, thanks very much to all of you for coming, and thanks for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be here today to share some ideas with you. So a panel on human nature, nothing daunting about that. But let's kick it off and say that humans by nature are sociable. People in general, by their nature, seek out relationships with other people. Not just to people that they're blood related to, and not just to their mates, but also other kinds of relationships. We might call these friendships, we might call these acquaintanceships, we can label them with anything we like. These can be partnerships to accomplish some goal, but people in general, by their nature, seek out some of these kinds of relationships in any group that we're talking about. And there's a lot that could be said about why that is a part of human nature and how we think we know that that is a part of human nature, but I want to take that as a starting premise and explore some of what we can understand about cooperation and conflict once we begin with the premise that a part of human nature is the sociability, this tendency to forge relationships with at least some other people. And let's be a little bit clearer to start. Just conceptually, to all get on the same page, we can envision what I want to talk about by thinking about an abstract group. Here is one depicted with 8 happy people, specifically 8 happy disembodied heads, but if we want to think about a relationship between any two of them, we could depict that by drawing a line between the two of them. And this would be one way to represent what we mean by a relationship, and that line is encoding the friendship or the acquaintanceship, some meaningful interaction between the two of them. Now that relationship serves them in many ways. It's meaningful for a lot of reasons, but it also accomplishes certain things. And one of the things that those relationships accomplish is, for example, consider the fact that each person in a relationship that we might care about has other relationships in their lives as well. And suppose that each of those 2 ends of the line that I've drawn for you each have at least one other friendship, acquaintanceship, relationship. What that means is that in having a relationship to someone else, you have that friend or acquaintance, but you also then have an indirect contact, say a friend of a friend, or access to another person. And once we start thinking about these indirect connections, and zoom out to the level of whole groups, what we're really thinking about is a vast web of relationships that comprise groups because of this human nature to forge relationships. So when we think about a group of people, that group of people is comprised of pairs of people with relationships, and zooming out to the whole group, that whole group has this vast web of relationships, friendships between people here and there, and we can call that vast web a social network. So what I want to talk about today are why social networks are relevant to our thinking about cooperation and conflict, given that they form as part of human nature. We have proclivities to form these networks in the first place. And it's worth noting here that in modern usage, social network triggers thinking about, Facebook, Twitter. Sure, we can think about those, but I want to think about a broader conception of a social network. What I mean is the whole set of interactions between people, meaningful relationships between people, whether you express them or interact with them online or offline, that counts as a social network. So a social network is just a set of relationships among people. So for instance, back to our happy group of 8 people, a social network that is possible, it could be that in this group, all 8 people have a direct relationship with all 7 other people. That's a possibility. It is perhaps likely if the group in fact only has 8 people in it. So for instance, if we're considering a very, very small town, or we're considering a committee or an organization, maybe it's reasonable to think that each of those people has direct relationships with other people. But it's also possible that for certain groups, like when we especially think about larger groups like towns, communities, neighborhoods, villages, even larger organizations, the kinds of social networks that we would have in mind don't entail every single person having a direct friendship, meaningful relationship with every single other person. And in that circumstance, that's where things get interesting, because some links are absent from the network. In this case, what I've depicted for you is 4 people in this hypothetical group have a direct relationship with one another, they're sort of a clique, and the rest have relationships as depicted like that. Because some links are missing, some people are better connected than others, and that matters for stuff of which I'll tell you about in a moment. But right now, I've just shown you examples of groups that I've made up and that don't mean much. We can do this for real groups if we like. Lots of research teams do this. I've been part of some of them that have done this. And so what I'm showing you here is a real social network among real people in a village in Uganda called Abalong. So what we did is we measured the relationships between people by asking them a series of questions to suss out who has relationships with whom within the village. And among the 320 people in the village, any line between dots there are showing you who has a relationship, we might label that relationship friendship, with others. Notice how not everyone directly has a friendship or a relationship with every other person. This village has a social network, and that social network is this particular shape. It is characterized by relationships that pattern itself in this way. If we go, and we did, go to a different village, ask people about their relationships, take a measure of who interacts with whom, who's friends with whom, you get a different picture, different patterns of relationships. Go to different circumstances for different reasons, different groups have different patterns of relationships. And these different patterns of relationships, these different shapes of social networks that people form by nature, matter quite a lot and can be used by groups to help enforce and encourage people to be cooperative and peaceful or not. And that succeeds or fails based on what the relationships are patterned like. That's an overview of what I want to tell you. I'll also note, because I think part of what you want to get out of a day like today is some fun facts. Fun fact, in general, human beings form social networks that have 2 very typical characteristics. One of those characteristics is, in general, if you take a look at a group, like a village that's been living together for a while, that's been allowed to form relationships as people would like, it tends to be the case that in these typical social networks among people, if you take any 2 people and see how close they are in the network, by which we mean, are they friends? Or are they at most friends of friends? Or are they friends of friends of friends? People in general tend to be very close in this sense. You don't have to do many hops of friends of friends of friends of friends to connect any 2 people. And this tends to be a characteristic of how human beings in general form their social networks across the board in lots of circumstances, if you give them enough time to seek out enough people. It also tends to be the case that these networks have shapes that have what's called high clustering, which is to say, in general, a person's friends, many of a person's friends, themselves forge friendships with one another. You see lots of triangles in the network is how you would observe it. But this means that in general, people tend to be part of within a larger network of more cohesive, tight-knit communities. And you can see that in the picture that we have of the social network within the village in Uganda, where in general, it doesn't take long to get from one person to another person in the village. But you also notice other interesting features of, for instance, this social network that jump out at us and that lead me toward explaining why this matters at all for our understanding of peace and cooperation. Notice how there are a couple of pairs of people depicted as dots floating up there near the top and in the top right that have a relationship just with one another, but they are not otherwise connected to the rest of their village's social network. We could ask questions like, why might that happen? Well, that could happen. Maybe those 2 people moved to the village recently and haven't forged a lot of meaningful relationships with others yet. And if we wait longer, maybe they will, or maybe they won't. Or maybe those two people find themselves less related to others in that village. They find themselves more, feel greater affinity for people in some other group that we haven't depicted here. And so all of their relationships are to someone else, but as far as this group is concerned, they don't really have a lot of relationships there. The shape of the network, that has those couple of pockets of people that aren't well integrated into the rest of the group, has important implications for how well this network works for enforcing peace and cooperation. So let me say a little bit more about how I want to think about this. Why this abstract concept of a social network should at all be relevant to our thinking today about peace. The shape of a social network, the pattern of relationships we form with one another when we're part of a group, a village, a neighborhood, a community, these patterns matter for lots of reasons. First order is, of course, because we get some meaning out of being related to other people and having these interactions. But the function of these relationships that I want to focus on is one of many things that these relationships can do, is they can be sources of information. That because you have these relationships, these ties to other people, you actually have access to a lot of information. That information can take many different forms. It can be some factoid of information, something that's just a fact, like where the polling station is. You have the option of turning to the people that you're friends with and asking them and learning, or maybe they've learned and they're going to tell you about it. It can be something that's a little bit more experiential, like you've gotten flu shots before. Did you get the flu less often? Let me amass information from you about that. And you can turn to your friends and develop information. Or similarly, maybe they were an early adopter with some bit of technology. They bought an iPhone X when they were fresh on the market, and you draw from their experience as to how they like it. And then because you are friends with them, you have these social ties, you have access to the information that they possess. So one thing, certainly not the only thing, that this web of relationships do within a community, within a group, is they serve as sources of information that can spread between the group members. Why this is relevant toward enforcing and encouraging peace and cooperation is one type of information that can spread through a social network, and that does spread through social networks, is information about who in the group is doing what and what we think about it. And this kind of information we could call gossip, and we're quite familiar with this type of information. Chatter about who is doing what, especially if that strikes us as something negative, a person who is misbehaving or violating some norm or doing something that we're judging good or bad, more often bad, can spread through social networks by a person seeking out their friends and sharing the information. In fact, researchers have conducted very interesting studies which amount to more sophisticated versions of eavesdropping on people, and through that scientific eavesdropping have concluded that about as much as 2/3 of human beings' conversation time with others is devoted toward what we might label gossip, by which we mean chatter about who's doing what, exactly why, what we think about it, the judgments about that, and so forth. So it is a natural tendency for people to talk about what other people are doing. It's newsworthy to us, and this is something that we turn to our social network, our relationships, and spread information about this as well. Okay, and to be clear, this kind of gossip counts as information because there is information in our gossip about what other people are doing, both the information about precisely who took what behavior and information about what we think about that. So why does this have anything to do with this conference on peace and security? It turns out the fact that by nature we form social networks, and by nature one of the things we use our social networks for is to gossip about others, these facts actually make it possible for groups to informally, from the inside out, enforce cooperative behavior, encourage cooperative behavior within the groups. The fact that we form social networks makes this possible. So let me tell you a little bit more about how this works, but first let's be a little bit more specific. I'm speaking very abstractly, cooperation in general. That's partly intentional. The things that count as cooperation are many. What we could mean is to be cooperative is to not commit homicide against others, to be peaceful. That would be cooperative. We could also mean, though, to be cooperative and contribute to some kind of common good, to some public good, make a contribution to some good cause. These behaviors could all count as cooperative. To be cooperative could also be just to be nice and form lines when the coffee samovar appears and not cut in line and rush there and take all the coffee. That could count as cooperative as well. So I mean to encompass a lot of these things by cooperation, and groups can and ubiquitously do use gossip through social networks in ways that encourage cooperation. So how does this work? In a nutshell, the way groups use gossip and social networks are two natural tendencies, or the products of our natural tendencies. We use social networks to spread gossip about behavior, in particular newsworthy behavior like who did something wrong. That information is newsworthy, and we tend to spread it, and we tend to spread it to our friends or acquaintances. That's very useful to a group, because if we know that someone did something wrong, we can respond to it. And as groups, we tend to have lots of options for what we might call punishment at our disposal. And now which context we're talking about makes certain things as punishment differently relevant, but the group can threaten punishment of some form in a way to dissuade that uncooperative behavior in the first place. Okay, so let's talk about a simple example of this first. An example of what might count as cooperation is behaving well in seminars. So in an academic setting, part of our department, we bring outside speakers in, ask them to give presentations, we assemble some students and some faculty, we listen, we ask questions, and we interact with the speaker. And I can assure you, having now been a professor at 2 different universities, norms differ strongly as to what counts as good behavior as an audience member of these kinds of seminars. And for instance, at Vanderbilt, where I am now, the norm is strongly what counts as good behavior is you are very polite, you are constructive, and this is how you should behave as a seminar participant. And so if you really start to pay attention, you can see the mechanisms that I'm describing at work. For instance, when I joined Vanderbilt's faculty, it became clear that if I violated this norm, what everyone else regarded as good behavior, and I was kind of mean and ruthless to a speaker, not only would the people in the room judge me badly for that, because I would be violating what they think is good, they could leave the room and tell other members of my faculty that I was misbehaving as well. And they probably would. It would be kind of noteworthy if I was a jerk in the middle of a seminar. This new person rolled in, look what she did. That would spread. It would spread as gossip, and it could spread through the department. And understanding that they have something like a tool of punishment at their disposal. I could either have my reputation be ruined, and that alone is dissuading me, or they could do other things. They could not invite me to the department party. They could exclude me from things. They could forget to email me about certain things. They could ostracize me in a certain sense. And because I know that gossip could spread information about my bad behavior, and they could do something in response to that bad behavior, I refrain from taking that bad behavior. It's a simple example of a group using these kinds of mechanisms to enforce norms. And if you asked someone, I don't know that they would tell you explicitly, oh, what I'm going to do is spread gossip about Jen's behavior to the contacts in my social network who will then spread it to others so that we can then amass punishment. It's just sort of a natural thing that we do that draws on social networks to enforce cooperation. And the reason that this process works across the board is because people understand that gossip can spread information about bad behavior. And if people believe that that's going to happen widely enough and that punishment could hurt enough, people are dissuaded from acting badly. Now, I gave an example about behavior in a department. So that's an example of cooperation in the sense of complying with some norm that some group has decided counts as good behavior. But there are actually examples of this occurring across the board in lots of different contexts. So in lots of situations, groups can use this kind of mechanism to encourage compliance with cooperative norms. It's also the case that there are lots of groups living outside of a strong government, and so without a strong legal system or strong police force that could take care of misbehavior for them, and lots of groups wind up creating something like this system to take care of and threaten wrongdoing in ways that keep people cooperating. And it can also be the case that if the kind of bad behavior we're talking about is bad behavior that would be technically illegal, but people don't believe that the legal system would respond to it or that the police force would respond to it, you also see lots of examples of groups coming together and agreeing on norms of what counts as cooperation and using these kinds of mechanisms to keep cooperation in place. And these webs of relationships that can help spread information about who's doing what are what determine how well this process works. And you can imagine that if the social networks are such that people don't really talk to other people, People just interact with one or two other people in their community, but that's it, and people are quite separated and segregated. This process doesn't work as well, because information about any person's wrongdoing doesn't spread very far, which means the expected punishment, the expected costs, the downside, the social stigma that a person would face is substantially reduced, and the process doesn't work that well. Whereas groups that have social networks that integrate everyone well, where there's lots of overlap between my friend group and their friend group, these are the kinds of social networks that can transmit information of any kind very widely, in particular, information like gossip about who's doing what. And that can be very useful for effectively peer pressuring people into cooperate. I wanted to close by telling you about a couple of specific examples, other than simply how people behave within academic departments. So one example is some research that I've done about a canonical example of a group in a so-called weak state setting, which is to say a group living somewhere where there's not strong government presence, and that is groups in the mining towns in, thank you, excuse me a moment. This should make this more pleasant for everyone. Groups in mining towns in the American Wild West. So in the mid-19th century, in the height of the gold rush in the United States, lots of towns grew up very rapidly where no town had existed previously, because word spread that perhaps there was gold there and money to be made. So in the American West, there were towns that began as a few tents, maybe 5 tents, and then people heard, and then it became 100 tents, and then it became 1,000 people, and they started to build and construct some towns, and then it became 5,000 people in the course of a month or two. These towns grew much faster than governance could grow up. There were no police forces in many of these towns. There was no legal apparatus. If someone mistreated you, you did not have the option of suing them or taking them to court or calling the police. These were communities with very weak governance in the formal sense. And in such an environment, we might expect that a group anywhere living under such weak governance would descend into chaos and violence, and theft would be rampant, especially when people are mining and there's valuable things that could be taken, and things are scarce anyway, so theft might be useful. We might expect chaos to ensue. But actually, across the board, these towns tended to be very peaceful. Peaceful in the literal sense, like not much violence, and peaceful in the sense of fairly high levels of cooperation, very little theft. There's lots of accounts of people saying, this is actually one of the safest places that I've ever lived. I could leave a stack of money or my gold ore sitting in my tent, and I understood that no one would take it. And if you dig deeper and try to figure out what's going on, why was peace so rampant at a place where it would be so easy for it not to be? What was going on is people understood that if they did something wrong, the rest of the community would hear about it very quickly. One reason for which is that there were many saloons in these towns. Saloons drew people together, very tightly concentrated. People chatted about news of the day, and something very newsworthy would be, that guy stole my stuff. People understood that many people would hear rapidly if they misbehaved, and they understood that in general, people tended to be armed. And so they anticipated that the punishment that could be doled out by the community, by posses that could form, by people that would exact vengeance when they learned that they did something wrong, could be very strong. And that understanding was ubiquitous, and that understanding disincentivized people from misbehaving. Here is a picture of one of these mining towns after it had taken off and they built wood construction, but these tended to be very densely constructed towns. And so in general, the story of the gold rush era was a rather peaceful story for a long period of time, in large part because these informal structures that made use of social networks among the miners and among the settlers worked very well. And in fact, there's another interesting story about at what point peace disintegrated, and it's in large part a story of development and newcomers settling in ways that didn't integrate them into the social network of the existing community, but settling into enclaves. And that broke down this mechanism that was sustaining peace, because now these little enclaves, if someone mistreated one of them and they tried to blow the whistle and spread the word, it wouldn't go very far. And people knew that, and so the disincentive to misbehave evaporated and cooperation started to break down. So even in a setting where it would be so easy to misbehave, groups can make use of these social networks and gossip in ways that can encourage cooperation and peace. There's lots of other examples such as this. This is, in fact, something like a typical example, and you can find examples in other places where you might expect cooperation to be quite challenging. Places where there's groups who have reason to be in conflict with other groups and who live near them, and yet don't descend into chaos and violence, for reasons that people are pointing to as mechanisms like what I'm telling you about, spreading gossip to encourage and incentivize cooperation. And we see lots of examples of this inside and outside the law. Other examples, I'll just leave you with this, other examples of cooperation are things like people coming together to form some common goal. And there's there's a wide array of scholarship trying to explain why people come together and protest, how that works, why sometimes people protest, sometimes they don't, why only some protest and others don't. And there are a lot of explanations out there. One piece of the answer is that people in general can effectively peer pressure each other into protesting together. So if there are some people who really want to protest and produce this so-called common good, like go out and exert energy to do some good for the world, they can also encourage others to do so, because if someone doesn't contribute to producing this public good for the world by protesting in favor of some important positive change, they understand that by refraining from doing so, word of that could spread as gossip through social networks, and the fear of the social shame or stigma is one factor of admittedly many that can encourage some people who are otherwise on the fence about it to contribute and cooperate and protest. So, in conclusion, what does this mean for our conceptualization of and study of peace and cooperation? Well, because this is a panel about human nature, my claim is that people, by nature, organize themselves into social networks. They seek out relationships, and certain factors determine exactly what those social networks wind up looking like at the level of the whole group. But this social network, whatever it looks like, can be used as a tool for enforcing peace. And so, when we're thinking through potential impediments to peace, or if we're interested in encouraging peace in places, especially from the ground up, like we've been talking about in a number of these panels, it's important to keep in mind that one place to look for answers or for potential improvements is the social networks themselves that connect people within communities, and to look at, are there natural impediments to the social networks spreading information widely, or are they separated in some way? If they're separated, for what reason? And are there tools that could better integrate the social network, to better integrate a community, to better allow them to make use of these very natural processes that keep people informed and abreast of who is doing what, and that can encourage groups to behave cooperatively across the board among all of their members? So with that, I will thank you. I will say that a lot of this is the product of research done in a variety of traditions. If you're at all interested in the details, you're welcome to ask me, of course, or you're welcome to have a look at my website where this all lives. And thanks very much, and I look forward to hearing your questions and feedback.
Okay, thank you very much. Next we have Dr. Autesserre. She's a professor of political science specializing in international relations and African studies at Barnard College and Columbia University. She's an expert in war, peace, peace-building, peacekeeping, humanitarian aid, and African politics.
Could one of the organizers help me pull up my presentation, please? Thank you so much, Kate. Fantastic. Thank you so much. So thank you so much, Dr. Mahmoudi. Thank you, Kate, for inviting me to this fascinating conference. And thanks to all of you for being here today. It's really a pleasure and an honor to present my new book manuscript, which is currently entitled On the Front Lines of Peace. And the book is still a draft. So I'm in the process of revising it for review and publication. So I'm extremely interested in any questions, comments, criticisms, suggestions that you all have for me, because that's going to help me revise the book and make it as strong as possible for when it is published. Afghanistan, Congo, Kosovo, Colombia, Syria, Ukraine, Timor-Leste. We've heard this story many times before. There was violence. The United Nations got involved. Donor countries pledged millions in assistance. Warring parties called for ceasefires. They held elections. They signed agreements, and the headlines praised peace. And then, a week or two later, sometimes just days later, violence flared up. Often it never actually ended, and in many cases, it lasted for years after. In just the past 5 years, wars have spawned the worst refugee crisis since World War II. 1.5 billion people live under the threat of violence in more than 50 conflict zones around the world. So peace building is a crucial task for many states and international institutions. And by peace building, I really mean any and all actions that help promote peace before, during, and after a conflict. United Nations peace interventions, international peace interventions have multiplied since the end of the Cold War. United Nations operations, non-governmental agencies, donors, and regional organizations that focus on peace have become increasingly numerous and influential. For instance, there are more than 90,000 soldiers who work as United Nations peacekeepers in 14 operations deployed on 5 continents. This represents the second largest military force deployed abroad after the US military. And people who have dedicated their lives to peace building agree that our templates for approaching war and peace just don't work. Inhabitants of war-torn countries and onlookers from the outside have grown wary of the apparent inability of governments and international institutions to stem the flood of violence. Plenty of books have discussed what has gone wrong when we've tried to resolve conflict in the past. But what has gone right? If we want to stop wars, we have to understand how to build peace. And it turns out that elections don't build peace, at least not right away. And democracy itself might not be the golden ticket. Contrary to what most politicians preach, building peace doesn't require billions in aid or massive international interventions. It often involves giving the power over to ordinary citizens. And it can even mean respecting superstitions and beliefs in magic that initially may seem bizarre. Ultimately, many successful examples of peace building in the past few years have involved innovative grassroots initiatives led by local people and at times supported by foreigners, often using methods shunned by the international elite. So that's the counterintuitive and ultimately hopeful argument of my book. On the Front Lines of Peace tells the stories of the ordinary yet extraordinary individuals and communities who have found a better way to confront violence. Rather than focusing on failed initiatives and on abstract peace agreements and negotiations between government and rebel leaders, On the Front Lines of Peace details the concrete, everyday actions that actually make a difference on the ground. Some of these are bizarre, some are creative, some involve age-old traditions, and some are just common sense. My book explains how peace building can work better so that we can finally improve the lives of billions of people. I show that to end violence from war and address lesser conflicts at home, we have to change the way we view and build peace. And the evidence I use to make this argument comes from research in 11 different war zones, including today's major hotspots, and 20 years of working in international aid as an activist and a researcher. I also built on more than 800 in-depth interviews with peace builders, warlords, victims, survivors, politicians, and local populations. And the book is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 describes the limitations of the conventional way to build peace, which relies on governments, elite, and foreign peace builders. Part 2 showcases how ordinary citizens, grassroots activists, and local leaders can make a difference. Drawing on these stories, Part 3 suggests a better way for foreigners to help reestablish peace in war zones. And the conclusion shows how Western citizens can use the lessons from the books to help decrease tensions at home, ranging from inner city conflicts to political and religious divides. So, to start giving you a sense of my actual findings, let me tell you a story that illustrates the typical relationships between people living in conflict zones and the foreigners who come to help. So one of my interviewees, Michel, was a Congolese businessman. He's still a Congolese businessman. And Michel is from a mixed background. He has Belgian, Portuguese, and Congolese ancestors. And Michel was very frustrated at the way interveners behaved toward him and toward other Congolese elites during meetings. He thought that interveners were talking down to local counterparts and that they didn't take local ideas into account. So during a meeting abroad, Michel conducted an experiment. Instead of introducing himself as Congolese, as he usually did, he pretended that he came from Puerto Rico. And the approach in the meeting was completely different. He had much more credibility and much more influence when he passed as an outsider. Most interveners assume that local people do not have what it takes to build peace, that they are incompetent, corrupt, and violent, otherwise they wouldn't be at war. And by contrast, outsiders believe that they have the required skills and expertise to build peace. This belief is largely rooted in the hierarchy of knowledge that exists in peace building. In the eyes of most interveners, what makes a good peace builder is education and work experience in specialized topics like gender or human rights and election organization. And if possible, having worked in a variety of conflict zones. In contrast, and although there are exceptions, the knowledge of country specialists is usually much less valued, and the knowledge of local people is usually trivialized. As a result, in virtually all aid and peace-building organizations, foreigners fill the management positions, and local people make up the lower-level staff. Very few local people make it into leadership positions in their countries of origin. To move up the hierarchy, they have to go abroad and become expatriates. At the same time, foreign peace builders often don't speak the local languages, and often they have no in-depth knowledge of the local societies, cultures, and institutions. So this all results in numerous absurd situations. Some of them are funny. So imagine coordination and management meetings in which people literally can't understand each other. Other times, the consequences are quite disastrous. Well-meaning international efforts have led to an increase in violence in places like Afghanistan and Congo. A large part of the problem is also the way we usually build peace in war zones. Western and African diplomats, United Nations peacekeepers, donor governments, and the staff of many non-governmental organizations involved in the resolution of conflicts. All of these people share a specific way of seeing the world. And I was one of these people, and I shared this culture, so I know all too well how powerful it is. Most politicians, peace builders, and ordinary observers assume that only top-down intervention can end armed violence. Another common assumption is that all good things come together. So, for instance, that democracy naturally leads to peace. And that's why the standard approach to war is to work primarily with national and international elites and to focus our time and efforts on organizing national elections, reconstructing state bureaucracies, and designing new national policies. And that's really something that we see in interventions all over the world, from Afghanistan to Congo, Iraq, and Timor-Leste. Unfortunately, this standard approach to peace has many limitations, and at times it has devastating consequences. Take, for instance, the international intervention in Congo. In Congo, because of how they are socialized and trained, most foreign peace builders interpret continued fightings and massacres as a top-down problem. So to them, the violence they see is the consequence of tensions between Congolese President Kabila and various national opponents, and tensions between Congo, Rwanda, and Uganda. In addition, these international peace builders view local conflicts as simply the result of national and international disputes, insufficient state authority, and the Congolese people's so-called inherent propensity for violence. So high-ranking peace builders focus on organizing large peace summits in places like Nairobi, South Africa, etc. And virtually all peace builders view the organization of general elections as a sort of cure-all. To them, it is the most crucial state reconstruction mechanism and the first and foremost condition for peace in Congo. Sadly, the push toward rapid elections often fuels extensive violence in post-war countries. So in Congo, as in many other conflict zones, the promotion of democracy has actually ended up undermining peace. The other big issue is that in Congo, like in a number of other conflict zones, many conflicts revolve around political, social, and economic states that are distinctively local. And when I say local, I really mean at the level of the individual, the family, the clan, the community. For instance, in Congo, there is a lot of competition at the village or district level over who will be chief of the village or chief of the territory according to traditional law, and who can control the distribution of land and the exploitation of local mining sites. Local tensions often result in localized fighting, say in one village or territory. So during one of my first trips to Congo, more than 15 years ago, I met this woman who was my age. She was named Isabel. Local militias had attacked Isabel's village. They had killed many men, raped many women, they had looted everything. And then they wanted to take Isabel, but her husband stepped in and he said, "No, please, please, don't take Isabel, take me instead." So he had gone to the forest with the militias, and Isabel never saw him again. And the reason why the rebels had attacked Isabel's village was not because of anything related to international or national wars, like the conflict between Rwanda and Congo, no. It was because the rebels wanted to take the land that the villagers needed to cultivate food and to survive. Isabel's story has stayed in my mind all these years because it embodies the awful consequences of local conflicts that foreign peace builders so often ignore. And local conflicts don't just have local or individual consequences. Local tensions frequently escalate into generalized fighting across a whole province and even at times into neighboring countries. Take the conflict between Congolese of Rwandan descent and the so-called indigenous communities in the Kivus. It started as a local dispute over access to land and traditional power, and it eventually escalated into a major crisis that has fueled the ongoing national and international wars in Congo and throughout the rest of Central Africa for the past 20 years. But unfortunately, international interveners deemed the resolution of local conflict an unimportant, unfamiliar, and unmanageable task. So they typically don't devote a lot of resources, time, and efforts to it. Quite a few peace builders have tried to change this standard approach to peace, and there has been some limited progress in recent years. But the majority of interveners still continue to focus on building peace from the top down, and especially on pushing for general elections. And in fact, something that keeps surprising me is the amounts of hostility I face when I suggest addressing local issues. So there is one guy, a former United Nations official who's turned into a think tank specialist. He seems to have made it his personal mission to refute every single piece I write on the benefits of bottom-up peace building in Congo. And unfortunately, he's only one of the many people who harbor such ingrained perception of what peace building should be, and that is top-down with a focus on elections. And again, it's not just a Congo story. Local conflicts sustain violence in many war and post-war environments, from Afghanistan to Sudan to Timor-Leste. But international peace builders really focus on building peace from the bottom up, in addition to doing so from the top down. So international efforts often keep failing to end violence on the ground, and sometimes they even make the situations worse. So how do we change that? Well, we really need to learn from success stories instead of always focusing on challenges, problems, and failure. So these past few years, I've looked for cases of surprising peace. Basically places where everything conspires to cause violence, and yet somehow you have peace. And I've found places like that all over the world, in Congo, Colombia, Israel and the Palestinian territories, and Somalia, etc. So, for instance, there is Ijwi, which is quite literally an island of peace in Congo. For the past 20 years, the deadliest conflict since World War II has raged around Ijwi, and more than 5 million people have died due to this conflict. But Ijwi itself has avoided mass violence. This is all the more surprising considering that the island contains all of the same preconditions for conflict that have fueled generalized fighting in other parts of Congo. You have a geostrategic location, mineral resources, ethnic tensions, lack of state authority, extreme poverty, local conflict over land and traditional power, and so on and so forth. What's fascinating about Ijwi is that order comes not through police cameras, guns, and ammunition, but through human participation. The island is peaceful because of the active, everyday involvement of all of its citizens, including the poorest and least powerful ones. So it's not the army, the state, or the police who manage to control tensions. And it's not foreign peace builders. It is the members of the community themselves. They have done that by fostering what they call a culture of peace, organizing in grassroots associations and local structures that help resolve conflicts, and drawing on strong belief that help deter violence by both insiders and outsiders, such as blood pacts. So blood pacts are traditional promises between two parties who agree never to hurt one another. The story of Ijwi shows us that local community resources can build peace better than the usual elite agreements or outside interventions. And the thing is that Ijwi is not an isolated case. The inhabitants of Somaliland have also managed to create a peaceful and prosperous region in war-torn Somalia. So there is a really interesting contrast between, on the one hand, Somalia, which is extremely violent and has some of the highest ranking in some of the world's least desirable categories. So most corrupt countries, second most failed state, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, you have this autonomous region in the north of Somalia that is called Somaliland and has experienced little violence in the past 20 years, little terrorism, and has a well-functioning state, decent public services, and some kind of functioning democracy. And there are many reasons for the difference, of course, but the key one is that Somaliland benefited from sustained grassroots peace-building initiatives, while the usual top-down, outsiders-led approach prevailed in the rest of Somalia. Somalilanders have built peace, and they've maintained peace for close to 20 years by using bottom-up strategies and relying on local leaders and ordinary people. Their experience shows that local peace building can make a difference, not only on a small scale, like in Ijwi, but also over a large territory and a quasi-state. And I've found other examples of surprising peace all over the world, like in Colombia and Israel. And in fact, in every single country where I've researched, I've found examples of ordinary citizens and local elites using their personal connections to convince the leaders of surrounding armed groups to come and negotiate. Fathers, mothers, uncles, brothers, sisters, and cousins reached out to their family members who were fighting. Teachers went to meet their former students. Priests, pastors, imams, sheikhs rallied their flocks, and village leaders and traditional chiefs talked to their subjects so that all would support an end to the violence. These committed individuals worked with combatants for months, sometimes years, until they found solutions that satisfied all of those involved. They ensured that each agreement was implemented and the situation monitored, and they tapped into their personal and community networks whenever they needed to address emerging issues. Their efforts paid off. They succeeded in containing fighting around their villages and in promoting common interest across political, social, or religious lines, at least for a time. So what we can learn from these uplifting stories, Ijwi, Somaliland, Colombia, etc., is that ordinary people and local leaders can promote what most of us would intuitively call peace. And so, what does it mean for us, people in the West, potential interveners, or elite from war-torn countries? Well, I'm not saying that we should replace the current top-down approach with bottom-up ones. It would be an error, and it would lead to disaster, because of course, convincing governments and rebel leaders to stop fighting is crucial. Instead, what I'm saying is that we need to promote bottom-up peace building in addition to the current top-down approach. We should elevate local peace building to equal status as the top-down strategies that we currently use to resolve tensions. So, how do we do that without falling into the same old tired relationships between outsiders and insiders that I've told you about, and without destroying local peace efforts, as interveners so often do? Well, there are role models that we can learn from. Take, for instance, the teams of the Life and Peace Institute in Congo. LPI is a Swedish peace-building organization that is involved in various conflict zones and usually focuses on working at the grassroots. Its teams in Congo have developed an approach that they call participatory action research. And here are the broad principles. The LPI Congo teams bases its actions on in-depth local expertise and rejects universal approaches to peace building. They rely on local employees supervised by a few foreigners, and these foreigners often have extensive pre-existing country knowledge. LPI does not implement programs directly. Instead, it works with and through a few hand-picked local organizations, and the main role of these organizations is to support people on the ground. These local organizations empower ordinary citizens to develop their own analysis of their community's conflicts, agree on the most feasible answers, and implement those solutions. So you see the difference with the usual way to build peace in war zones. In the LPI model, it's not foreigners based in capital cities and headquarters who conceive, design, and implement peace-building programs. It's not national or provincial elite either, and it's not the state or the government. Instead, it is the intended beneficiaries and community members themselves, including ordinary people, who conceive, design, and implement peace-building initiatives with the help of LPI and its local partners. And I'm happy to give you a concrete example during the discussion if you're interested in seeing how this works in practice. And in my research, I found a lot of these kind of original, out-of-the-box approaches by interveners who did manage to put local people in the driver's seat and to actually make a difference on the ground. There are lots of foreign peace builders who challenge the usual ways of living and working that their colleagues use. And I talk about these people a lot in the book. They're named Peter Van Holden, Vijaya Thakur, Banu Altumbas, James Camberry. I could go on and on. They come from all over the world, and they work for very different organizations in very different countries. But they have a few things in common. They don't believe that as outsiders, they know better. They have the right theories, skills, and expertise, or they bring the ideal solutions to people's problems. Instead, they respect local residents. They listen to them, and they're humble. They also know the local context well. They speak at least some of the local languages, and they have extensive local networks. They are in it for the long run. They stay on site for years, sometimes decades. They are open-minded. They understand that other people may have a different understanding of peace, democracy, or development, and different priorities. They don't place themselves at the forefront of peace efforts. Instead, they maintain a low profile, and they turn the spotlight on the achievements of their local partners, local elite, local staff, local organizations, ordinary people. They're flexible. They keep adapting their strategies based on the results they get, the obstacles they face, the feedback they receive from local residents and peace project implementers, the way the military, political, security, economic situation evolves, and so on and so forth. And lastly, they understand that sometimes there are hard choices to make, because all good things do not go together. So we may have to choose between two worthy goals, for instance, between democracy and peace or justice and peace. And the best interveners understand that they shouldn't be the ones to make these choices. The people who will have to live with the consequences of a decision should be the ones making it. And by way of conclusion, there is one last thing that I want to mention. All of these ideas, all of these lessons from conflict zones can help Western citizens address conflict at home, like racial, religious, ethnic, political tensions in the United States and in Europe. And I'm happy to elaborate on that during the discussion if you're interested. But the overall point is that whether at home or abroad, we need more individuals like Peter, Banu, Vijaya, and James, and like the inhabitants of Fiji and Somaliland. We sorely need more organizations that work, like the Life and Peace Institute, and more programs that follow the basic principles that I've told you about. Because it's with individuals and organizations like these that we can help the 1.5 billion people who live under the threat of violence in conflict zones around the world, and that we can also make things better at home. And of course, all of these ideas will not be magic ones. But because they take into account deeply rooted causes of conflict, they could definitely be game changers. Thank you so much.
Okay, with that, I'm happy to field questions from the audience. And I'd ask that you introduce yourself and then tell me which, or if your question is directed to both panelists.
Hi, my question is actually to Dr. Larson. So I was just curious about the social network example you used with a village in Uganda and why that particular site, when that could be something you could draw from, say, rural Wisconsin. What is it you found different?
Great question. In the example that I showed that's from a village in Uganda, we chose because it's a part of a larger research project that's in part trying to examine whether or not you observe ties that cross ethnic groups at all. Like, there's a large literature in political science that argues that when different ethnic groups live in the same place in sub-Saharan Africa, they often don't forge relationships across ethnic lines. But we were startled, I say we, that work is collaborative with Professor Janet Lewis at the US Naval Academy. We were startled when we were trying to build on some of that work and track down the original research on which the claims were based to learn there was very little empirical investigation of what actual social relationships were like anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa. So because Janet has deep expertise doing lots of in-depth field work from her own work, which studies former rebel groups from Uganda from the rebellions in the 80s, that became the country that we worked in, largely for practical reasons, that's where we could set up well, and that's where we tried to do our first cut examination. And we, I can say a lot more about that larger project because it's a much larger project, and even in its current form was a pilot study, and we hope to replicate this kind of study to get a view of what people's interactions in their daily lives are like in lots of different villages, in lots of different countries, in countries where we can compare developed and developing countries. There's a lot of basic research that needs to be done here, and we think that a much broader set of research does need to be conducted.
Hi, my name is Maud Morrison. I'm with Build Up, and I just really wanted to say thank you first. I actually wish you'd been the keynote in a way for the panel we did yesterday, because I think a lot of what you were saying about locally led and locally driven peace building needs to be elevated. And I think Nanjira and I were trying to say that a lot yesterday, so thank you. I also had a question, and actually I had a question about whether the reaction that you're finding from institutions like the UN, if you're already presenting this, and how much traction you feel you're getting. And then for Dr. Larson, I had a question, which is, I mean, I really like the theory that social networks can do a lot of good, but how do you deal with the cases where the social network is very strong according to the criteria that you set out, but that the cooperation that they are persuading people towards is very negative? So I'm thinking of, I worked in Myanmar for several years, and I'm thinking of the sort of cooperation towards the persecution of a minority group, which by all accounts was what the population kind of decided they wanted to do, and it was a very strong social network. So I just wondered how you deal with that. Thank you.
So I wish I could have been here yesterday because the panel sounded fascinating. Unfortunately, I was teaching, so I couldn't attend. Thanks. The reaction, well, it's a brand new project. I've just started presenting it. I think it's the third time I'm presenting it in public. And I presented it, I think, last week at the International Peace Institute, and there were lots of UN people and diplomats in the room. So the reaction was the organizer of the panel said that it was a huge indictment to the way things work, and I probably made a lot of people angry. But then lots of the people who were actually sitting, like the diplomats and the UN people, they came to see me afterwards and they were like, hey, can we have, can I have your book? Can you do consultancies for the UN? Can you do something? Can you come and talk to us, etc.? So seems to be very positive, but again, it's really, really brand new, just starting to present the findings.
Great, and thanks, Maud, for your question as well. It's a really great point that all the things that I'm describing and loosely saying, so groups can use these mechanisms to enforce cooperation, could go awry if the thing that counts as cooperation in the eyes of a group is to cooperate to, say, persecute a minority group. And unfortunately, there have been examples of exactly this happening, where the networks and the mechanisms that I'm describing get used for something that we would call, looking down on them, a bad thing, but they are as cooperation toward doing some bad. So the first order consideration is, if the kinds of principles that I was describing are going to be accounted for in a peace-building process, they need to be accompanied by an attempt to convince people of the norm that we would count as good, like not to be used for persecution. So that's a very important point, and I'm glad you raised it. Also, part of what Janet and I are working on studying next is, if there is a community with a cohesive social network that is enforcing something that we think is socially undesirable, cooperation for bad, how can it be to change the group's norm? Are there ways to push on the group, push on the network, or push on the norm to sort of change what the equilibrium is, what the outcome is that people are enforcing? And so far, it's preliminary, but so far there does seem to be a sort of sweet spot kind of network, where networks that are too cohesive, full of people that are too, I guess we would say, stuck in their ways. These are especially in places with very low mobility, few people are coming in, few people leave. Those tend to be the harder networks in which to change minds. Whereas places that still have networks that could transmit information widely, but not so dense that it's full of people that are just so tightly cohesive, those tend to be the sort of most promising cases for changing minds for good. But it's just the beginning of that research, and we want to do a lot more there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Severine.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for the research, because these things are, most of the locals know, because I'm one of those locals. I mean, I lived in Rwanda my entire life, and I have so many friends from Congo. And I've worked with NGOs too, so all the structures that you talked about, they exist, and people know about that. So I was wondering why, two questions. First, why do you think you're facing the resistance? Is it because of maybe the vested interests, like this new industry of international development that has formed, and so every time you criticize the existing structures, you may be trying to put them out of business? And secondly, those who are trying to do, to facilitate local efforts for peace building, I'd like you to elaborate a little more on like some of the specific things that they're doing, the models that they're using. And I also was wondering whether how they interact with local structures, or whether they're more successful in countries like Congo where the local government does not function, because I would suspect that it would be more difficult in countries where the authority is more centralized. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the resistance, I've been puzzled by it, because when you think about it, as you're saying, it's common sense. I mean, it's the kind of thing that if you spend some time in conflict zones and if you talk to people, it's obvious that, you know, bottom-up work and that local people have experience and expertise. It's like, it's not rocket science. No, but seriously. So I've been trying to understand why there is such resistance and why people get so emotional and so angry sometimes when I present my work. And so I have like a tentative ideas. So the first one is that like people have spent a lot of time building expertise on something, and I'm telling them, well, your expertise doesn't matter, and basically, you know, we don't need you. So as you say, you know, there is vested interest in trying to think that their expertise still matters. So there is also something more subtle, which I think is a very part of their identity. So for many of them, they believe I'm a diplomat. You know, I work in an international, interstate organization. So part of my very identity is to interact with other states, with governments. And so they don't see themselves at all as interacting with local people. So really the way they see themselves is really important. And the last thing, and I don't know how much it matters, but I think it does. It's just a matter of like how pleasant it is to do the kind of work that I'm advocating for, as opposed to interacting with governments and ministers. Like most of the time when you do local level work, it means that you're not going to stay in capital cities and headquarters. You're not going to have electricity. You're not going to have running water. Your hotel is going to be very basic. Sometimes you're going to have bugs all over the place. You won't be able to sleep at night because the cows start yelling or something. I mean, it's not fun. And then you meet with people who don't speak your language. You arrive and you say, hey, you know, I'm so-and-so, and the person doesn't know what so-and-so means, and they don't care, so they don't. So, you know, it's just not as fun and rewarding and prestigious. And I really think that somehow this matters as well. So expertise, identity, and just the, you know, how pleasant it is to work on these things. And on how they interact with local structures. I mean, that's the reason why, I don't know if you remember the map I showed at the beginning. I really tried to have a range of countries with completely different situations in terms of war and peace, but also in terms of government capabilities. And for example, in Colombia and in Israel, government capability is extremely high, but I've still seen the same kind of general patterns. And, you know, there are tons of differences, obviously, between the way my model interveners, the way they work in Congo and the way they work in Colombia. But the things that I mentioned during my presentation, the fact of being low profile, humble, you know, building on the expertise of ordinary citizens, etc. That's all the things that I've seen all across the place, whether the central government is super strong or whether it's super weak.
Derek Kalin, Counterpart International. My question is for Dr. Larson. I really was interested in the network map that you showed in your presentation, and I wonder if you could go into a little bit more detail about what the different connections between nodes mean, what strength of a relationship is represented by those. So is that I've heard of this person, or we are blood kin, or somewhere in between? And then secondly, could you talk a little bit about the tools used both for data collection and the visualization end? Thank you.
Sure, great question. There is a large and growing set of researchers interested in the methodology for measuring networks. Our job would be much easier if we were trying to just use digital trace data, but that is not how we collected these data, as you might imagine. And so we use survey methods. And the methods that we used for collecting the relationships was what's called a name generator approach. So we used a survey, and we visited villagers' either homesteads or asked them at an event that our research team had hosted, a battery of 7 questions. And each of the questions asked name up to 5 people with whom you do something. And those somethings were things like with whom you regularly discuss politics, whose homesteads you regularly visit, with whom you regularly share a meal, and some of them were concrete, like shared a meal within the last week. And the visualization that I showed you was showing a representation where a line was drawn between any 2 respondents in our survey. If one of them said that they listed the other one's name in response to any of those questions. There's other things that could be done. There's lots of different ways to choose to visualize that. You could require that they both listed each other. We don't lose too many links if we impose that requirement on our data. You could ask follow-up questions about how often do you visit the homestead, et cetera, to get better measures of strength. I'm not representing any of those in that picture. And then 2, we conducted the survey with pen and paper, had our enumerators write things down. I will never do that again. If I can ever scrape the money at all through any means, I will do data, and I will have the enumeration team do data entry on tablets or some other electronic form, because that was terrible. But then amassed the data, got it together, and then that visualization was made in the freeware Gephi software. Yeah. Sure.
I'm not sure this is actually a question because you very nearly answered it in response to the previous question about and your answer about expertise, but as probably the only geographer in the room, the question of disciplinary expertise and its relationship to peace seems to me to be fundamental here. I'm thinking of development, I'm thinking of the climate change stuff, which I'll talk about later, but listening to you in intervention, I'm thinking of Pajero culture. Because Pajero culture is what the folks in Kathmandu used to call all the NGOs who showed up in Kathmandu to do peacemaking and development 15 years ago. And the first thing they did when they got to Kathmandu was to buy a Pajero SUV for the big, really ugly Mitsubishi ones, right? And it seemed to be a status symbol amongst the development community that they weren't serious players unless they were driving Pajeros. Of course, none of the locals drove Pajeros, so inevitably we became, the folks became the Pajero culture because this was a clear marker of foreign external intervention with a culture and technology that made no sense to the locals. But it seems to me that there are all sorts of parallels in the development industry with the peacemaking in discussions that you're doing, which would probably flesh out your case studies. And of course, this is also now spilling over into the climate adaptation business, which of course is both security and development, now tied into climate. So it seems to me that one of the things that's hanging over both of these discussions is the question of the appropriateness of particular forms of political expertise, because quite obviously, if we are seeing like a state, to use Scott's famous phrase, there's an awful lot of other things that are not being seen, and that kind of theorization seems to me to be crucial to what's underlying your contribution here. So I'm not sure that is a question, but thank you for your presentation.
Even if it's not a question, I can respond. Yes, there are lots of parallels between the peace-building industry and the development industries, and I've written extensively on that in my previous book, and I teach about that I was actually teaching about that yesterday instead of coming to the panel that I really wanted to attend. So I agree, there are lots of parallels with the development industries, and someone could take the same book and writing on development aid worker. It's just that I'm already trying to keep it short, and it's hard for me, and just focusing on peace builders is more than enough. But if anybody is interested in doing the same research on development worker, I think that would be fascinating.
I think we have time for just these 2 remaining questions. So I've been told to try to wrap it up by 3. So
Don't know if it's burning. Michael Allen. Response to both. Yes, I'd just like to say that these lessons these insights have been around for at least 3 decades. And it strikes me that it takes a long time to learn them. That the patterns that you describe in aid and in peacemaking and so on replicate the same power structures that caused the damage in the first place. So that's one point. On the question of networks, I'm very fascinated, as we were saying in our sidebar earlier. You mentioned that there was a dearth of empirical studies actually to show patterns of language and ethnicity within particular villages, the extent of integration. And I'm wondering whether you've looked at the breakdown of cohesion. So there are networks. You are showing in some instances, I presume, that there are villages where people of different ethnicities have integrated networks amongst themselves. I'm thinking like cities like Sarajevo and other places where people used to eat with each other across religious and ethnic lines, but under certain kinds of trauma, the group disintegrates into separate networks, even though they might still be living in the same places. And I wonder, what are the factors that cause networks to break down? What's the geography of network formation and disintegration?
Do you want to go first?
Oh, sure. So I agree and disagree with your question. To me, the patterns have been around for much more than 3 decades. When you look at colonial patterns in India, in Africa, etc., you have exactly the same kind of dynamics that I've been talking about, and it's just a new form of these dynamics. And so that's why, what I find puzzling is why it's not that they perpetuate, is why we know that they are problematic. So why do they perpetuate? And that's the topic of my previous book, Peaceland. That was anyway. Great book. But what I'm hoping to do with this new book is to, with the focus on success and on things that actually work, to help us move forward with this debate, rather than saying, okay, it doesn't work, we know it doesn't work, why doesn't it work? Now thinking, okay, look at this because that works, and that's the kind of thing that we can emulate.
And thanks for the question. There you are. Thanks for the question about the disintegration of networks. It's very fascinating. And I would say the question of Sarajevo-style breakdowns remain something of a puzzle, where you could have a place that seems like there was a quite cohesive social network interconnecting lots of different groups, and then suddenly, as if overnight, now people aren't talking to one another, now the dissolution has happened. So at best, what I and other scholars have done to study it is take networks that we have measured, so precisely encoded the sets of relationships, and ask theoretically which ties, if removed, would disintegrate the network. That's not completely satisfying. It leads to results of the form when 2 different groups have relationships just from a few people that interconnect them. That's much more fragile than when groups have lots of ties that are all mixed up with one another. But there too, that's not terribly surprising. What we'd really like to do is take measures of groups during the process of disintegration so that you could ideally identify precisely which ties are the kind that go away most easily. And the question really is it a property of a relationship, just in general, that it is more fragile to dissolution? So perhaps some relationships are just stronger and more meaningful than others, and the less meaningful, the weaker ties, can go away in an instant. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe it's the case that which ties go away is a product of political manipulation, that there can be someone who tries to drum up the usefulness of some ties and get people to dissolve certain other kinds of ties. But these are quite open questions empirically. So far, we just have ideas for how this might work.
Okay, final question.
Yes, Professor Severine, I'm Craig Murphy from Wellesley College. I love your work. I'm really going to like this new book, I know. It struck me when you were describing the characteristics of the people who really make a difference as external interveners, that you were describing people who are very saintly. I mean, they are dedicated, they are modest, they listen, these are a whole series of characteristics of people who are very, very good people. I've studied more people involved in development than people involved in peacemaking, although some of the same sort in the UN system. And I've run into a lot of people who actually are saintly in that way. I mean, that is to say, more than perhaps 2 hands full out of probably thousands of people that I've thought about. And I'm wondering if the reason we don't see this is because most of us aren't really like that. I remember having a conversation with a former head of the UN Development Program where he was saying, well, you know, what I wanted to do when I was head of UNDP was create an organization where you didn't have to be a saint in order to actually do good work. And I've had this thought in the back of my mind for years that, you know, he was nuts. The actual good work that has been done by many of the UN agencies has all been done by people who are, you know, have extraordinary capacities as individuals to be modest, to put themselves below, to spend years in a single place, to not buy and want to be driving around, to not show the flag, as they sometimes say in the UN, that is having the big white SUV with the UN flag on, and all of those things. And maybe that's the reason that we don't find these people in many of the official places, but we can still find them everywhere. But anyway, I'm just wondering if you would agree or disagree, or is that just crazy?
Thank you so much. I wonder, I mean, I also wonder if it's precisely because they keep low profile that we don't see them, we don't pay attention to them, because, you know, they don't put themselves forward. They're not gonna. So by definition, but therefore we don't see them. So it's kind of a vicious circle. I mean, they're not saints. Some of them are my friends because I've interviewed them for so many years that now they've become friends. They're clearly, I mean, they have, they're definitely not saints. They have characteristics that are helpful for peace building. And I mean, apart from the fact that we don't see them, because again, low profile, blah, blah, I also wonder if the international organizations, the way we structure recruitment makes it very difficult for recruiters to actually recruit people like that. Because I have a lot of students who are modest, who are, you know, who would be happy to be low profile, who know the local language, they know the local context, but when they send their CV, they don't know how to sell themselves. And when the recruiters see their CV, they're like, oh, she speaks the local language and she knows the local context, but who cares because she doesn't have 10 years experience working in gender in 5 different places or 10 different places. So I think there is a lot that we can do working with human recruiters, to human resources people, to show them that there are traits and there are characteristics that they should pay much more attention to when they recruit people to send to the field.
I'm sorry, I would like to follow up on this. I mean, you have opened up for me probably a possibility for a whole conference on this topic. But my question is this, that what I see as I listen to the model you're presenting as a huge challenge is really there's a whole hegemonic approach that pervades, and I don't want to be stereotypic, but it's mostly in the Western world, that says that somehow it knows how to solve the problems of the rest of the world. And again, I say that with all due respect to the Western world in which I live, but what is required to bring greater understanding and education to this area, to me, seems to be in the arena of understanding the true nature of diversity. I mean, we throw this word around, but, you know, what's good for the Congo is not necessarily good for the next door neighbor, is not necessarily good for another nearby country. Do you see what I'm saying? There is a diversity here in this world that I think needs to be allowed to exist. But how do we do that? And how do we change this old paradigm, if I may refer to it as that, which the West seems to really think that it has the answers? Thank you.
Well, I mean, that's exactly what I hope to be doing to start doing with the book and with presentations like that, and by teaching I think that as teachers, we have a huge opportunity and we have a lot of influence on our students. And it's one thing that we can really, like the kind of influence that we can really have. And it's not with one book or one class or one conference that we can change things, but the more of us start saying the same thing, start challenging the paradigm that you talk about, start teaching our students that the West doesn't have the answer and that there is no right answer for everyone, etc., etc. The more we're likely, it's not going to be a change overnight, but the more we're likely to have an incremental change that eventually, perhaps, we're going to have a chance of over the long term doing that. And I know it's not the ideal, I'm going to save the world tomorrow answer that I'm sure many of us would wish we had. But on the other hand, at least that's realistic. And that's better than thinking, well, there is nothing we can do and we're just going to continue reproducing this kind of paradigm.
Please join me in thanking our excellent panelists.